Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Matt Rojansky, director of the Kennan Institute. It's a real privilege to be able to host today's event. Я очень скоро перейду на русский, но как начало просто буду всех представить на английском языке. I'm just going to do the introductions in English. So anybody who's listening on the direct translation, why can I not think of the English word for what this is? The live stream on Medusa. Thank you very much to Medusa, but don't worry, we will switch to Russian. And those in the audience here who would like a translation, all you have to do is just put the earphones on. It's already set up. Just make sure the volume is to your liking. So today's event, of course, will be about the Russian presidential election, what's next, or as Dmitry has already informed me, the electoral procedure. What's next? We're 2 days after Sunday's voting event, and the questions, of course, revolve around what is happening inside of Russia, what will happen with Russia's role in the world, and what will happen next. And we simply couldn't have a better panel, I think, to address those questions, and have been very lucky with the weather because all three of them flew in yesterday, and they don't have to fly out until after all of this weather has moved on. So we're very fortunate. I hope they feel very much at home here in snowy Washington this afternoon and tomorrow. Just one note that on Thursday we have an event at 3:30 here at the Wilson Center, a musical discussion from New Babylon to King Lear, the Kozintsev-Shostakovich collaboration, which will be done in partnership with the Post-Classical Ensemble and the AFI Silver Theater and Cultural Center. I hope you can join us for that on Thursday here at 3:30. So I'm going to introduce the speakers in a slightly different order, but they'll speak in more or less the order that they're sitting. So our three visiting analysts, and then our own resident expert, Sergei Parkhomenko, will bat cleanup, as we say. So Dmitry Oreshkin is a well-known Russian political analyst and political geographer. He's worked for many years at the Institute of Geography in the Academy of Sciences, where he created an analytical team producing electronic maps. He was named Person of the Year by the Rambler.ru internet portal in 2001, and writes and provides commentary widely in the Russian press, including Echo Moskvy, New Times, Snob, and others. Kirill Rogov is also a well-known political analyst in Russia, frequently quoted in Western media outlets like The Economist, The New York Times, and The Washington Post. He publishes regularly in Forbes Russia, Vedomosti, Novaya Gazeta, RBK, Süddeutsche Zeitung, and Financial Times, and is a senior researcher now with the Indem Foundation and a board member of the Liberal Mission Foundation. He also co-founded in 1998 Polit.ru, an influential media platform. Ekaterina Shulman is a political scientist and senior lecturer at the School of Public Policy of the Russian Presidential Academy of National Economy and Public Administration, RANEPA. She's the author of several books and a regular contributor also to Vedomosti, the New Times, Republika, Kolta.ru, Carnegie, and others, and previously served as an assistant to a deputy in the Duma, a political analyst, and an expert in the analytical department of the Duma. Sergei Parkhomenko, of course, is in residence here at the Kennan Institute as a George F. Kennan expert and a journalist for Echo Moskvy, where he records his show every week. He is the founder of several projects aimed at developing civic activism and promoting liberal values in Russia, and founded and was the first editor-in-chief of Itogi, which was Russia's first current affairs weekly published in cooperation with Newsweek. He was also editor-in-chief of several publishing houses producing translated fiction and nonfiction literature, and served as editor-in-chief of Vakrug Sveta around the world, Russia's oldest monthly magazine. So with that, I am going to turn the discussion over to Ekaterina to start us off, and I will try to keep our discussants more or less within 10 to 15 minutes so that we have plenty of time for questions from the audience. Пожалуйста, мы начнем.
Спасибо большое. Спасибо за возможность высказаться на такой уважаемой площадке. Дорогие организаторы, дорогие слушатели, мне хотелось бы в начале, открывая нашу дискуссию, сказать несколько слов о том, мы здесь все, видимо, будем пользоваться термином Дмитрия Орешкина, о том электоральном мероприятии, о том электоральном событии, которое произошло в России в воскресенье. Обсуждая выборы, в особенности выборы федерального уровня в России,
talking about election in Russia, it's hard to maybe determine their composite. Elections is administrative event. Participation of voters is rather secondary if you consider the administrative framework. This event is organized by the federal political management and regional and local management. And so participation in this event by the voters has a place, but it's not the most important role, on the one hand. On the other hand, the results are often falsified, but we can't say that they are too far removed from reality. We can't do that. So not a single of no concept of the two extremes that people publicly speak about is not really true. We can't say that the elections reflect the free votes of the citizens, but we also can't say that the results are completely fabricated and have no relation to what people want and what kind of social demand exists in Russia. So our task is made more difficult by that. Why is it important to see how the election campaign is happening? We need to look at the evolution of administrative methods that the elections are organized by, and I would like to say a few words about that. And then we also need to look at the evolution of the falsification methods, because they also change. Technology continues to evolve, and not only falsification technologies, but technologies for fighting with them. And it is a multifaceted process that I'd like to cover. And direct connection between the election campaign, what happened during it, and the political agenda of the new presidential term, there is no connection there, and we must understand that. During the previous elections in 2012, no declarations of the victorious candidate, nothing that you could consider his program platform contained contained what he actually did in the next 6 years. So if you consider what was said and what was done during the pre-election campaign, and if we can't really base any conclusions on that. But nonetheless, we maybe should make some conclusions, but not based on the public part of his campaign. As far as the organization of the elections and the administrative participation in this event, traditionally, the situation is such: the administration of the president, its political bloc, gives a general framework, some kind of a concept of how the elections are going to happen. Local authorities organize the actual practical part of it. And the task of the regional and municipal leader is to demonstrate during the elections that he controls his territory, that he can provide the needed results. What does it mean, needed results? Not just to send the statistics to the center. The campaign must go smoothly and peacefully without scandals. And during the election day, there should be no unpleasant news, and generally speaking, nothing should happen that would attract attention. And of course, the counting of the votes should not have any objections or protests around them. So that would be correct organization of the elections. As far as the federal center and its methods and technologies that they used during elections to suit them. What new things did we see during these elections? Two things. First of all, as became clear during the parliamentary elections in 2016, the main basic tool that guarantees the necessary results for elections is preventing access to possible participants in them. All those other methods, such as controlling the media, the mass media, or financial mechanisms, or determining who can sponsor this or that candidate, all of that secondary to that main tool. cutting off access. And this is not a new thing in 2018. More or less, always, the list of participants was controlled by the administration, and the more important the elections, the stricter the controls. But what we saw this year during these elections, as far as the list of participants, reminds me more of the elections of 2004, which also, if you remember, were second term out of two possible terms. So need to secure against any risks. So what they did this time? First of all, they prevented the main opposition candidate from participating. That was rather predictable. It happened. They also replaced KPRF candidate with a new person who, at the same time, we can't really say that administration dictated it. Maybe he wanted it that way. But at the same time, it was meant to scare away communist voters and not attract anybody new. And also, the list of candidates where a liberal candidate should be, as it was in 2012 was Prokhorov, such candidates, I don't want to really offend anybody, I'm trying to be correct, but some candidates that are difficult to see seriously. So this was a new flavor to all of the participants of these elections, except the main one. And this reminds me of the elections in 2004, when the leader of LDPR, Zhirinovsky, was actually replaced by his bodyguard during those elections. So that was that then. So prevention of access is the first thing. Second, turnout, and increasing turnout using the administrative resource. And I see here some changes and evolutions. Turnout was the main problem of this campaign, and this became obvious during the election campaign, during the parliament elections in the fall of 2016, when the turnout was not just low, but ultra low. And in Russia, it was about 48%. 49%, and in large cities, especially in Moscow and St. Petersburg, it was even lower, and in the central regions of Russia. And so good turnout in the various republics and territories of voter anomalies, so to speak, where elections happen with minimum involvement of voters. So those usually have good statistics. So it became clear that turnout, not the result on its own, is going to be the main problem for the president. And so how did they solve this issue? First of all, we must admit, and I hope you understand, that finally they decided to maybe write in some extra results at the end. But the main part that wasn't written in was made using this voters dependent on the administrative resource. Who are these people? People who are directly or indirectly paid by the government, depend on the government to survive. And these are government officials, civil servants, federal, regional, and municipal. Also, armed bureaucracy of all levels, security, law enforcement, judicial, all of that. And policemen per person is the highest number in Russia overall in the world. Also, army. Military, also government corporation employees and government banks. Also, a lot of people are employed there. And the so-called people working who are supported by the budget, education, social and healthcare, and also, last but not least, a very important class that support Putin's political regime is also the municipal employees, municipal sector. People who came early to the polling stations and created this beautiful picture of long lines to cast their ballots, and good numbers in the news that 10 a.m. Turnout is twice as much as it was in 2012. So this made a great impression on all of the consumers of this information and news. And mobilization of these voters came from regional heads to employers is an important thing, because the main providers of voters, the owners of the packages of votes during this campaign, were heads of companies. People were mobilized and brought to voting polls by their employers. There were some interesting details that meant to increase the propaganda of what was going on. For example, people were brought from regions to vote in Moscow. Why did they do that? Not so that they would vote several times. They didn't want any violations like that, but they wanted to paint a picture at the voting polls that there were a lot of people, and to smooth out any kind of differences in results between Moscow and regions that always existed, in order to kind of smooth out the picture and the difference between Moscow and St. Petersburg and other more regional cities. As far as falsifications and violations themselves, as I've already said, evolution of the falsification technologies is a very interesting process and subject. And things continue to evolve, life moves on, and some improvements in this sphere have been observed. And this has to do with the progress in technologies. More and more, it becomes difficult to isolate completely and to hide completely what is happening at the voting polls and during the voting count. It also has to do with the stronger civil society in Russia, and such organizations as Association Golos and observers associations and volunteers who, during election campaign at all levels, municipal, regional, and federal, observe the elections. And I also would like to thank the Central Electoral Committee and their work, and the work for the federal political management aimed to prevent the most scandalous falsifications, the most obvious ones. And so civil observers created an interesting phenomenon, rather specific hybrid characteristics. Association Golos was deemed a foreign agent and was registered as such, and they were terrorized rather strictly. Police pressure was applied on them. At the same time, they are part of the electoral process. They're part of every elections. They cooperate with the Central Electoral Committee. They participate at the various meetings. It is mandatory for them to be present during the electoral process. So it is a situation that may seem rather strange to an outside observer. So what did we see with falsifications this time? Based on the data we received from our specialist on electoral statistics, Sergei Shpilkin, Radel Romanudotov, and others who for many years have been working to monitor these technologies, what did I see based on the data? It seems that writing in of turnout took place. But at the same time, the percentage was preserved. According to Sergei Shpilkin's evaluations, first he said that during the voting day that the falsifications were low, the levels of 2004, lower than in 2012, but then he said no, maybe it was somewhere between 2004, 2012. From 7 to 10 million votes, according to his estimates, appeared. While at the same time the proportion of vote distribution was remained. And according to Central Electoral Commission, at the end of the day on Sunday, they said 63.5% turnout. Next day, it became 67.6%. That is the official number now. Why did they do this if this doesn't really affect the final outcome? And we must be careful here. saying these things because it is only our estimates. I think that the turnout was approximately the same as it was in 2012, maybe a little lower, a little more, depending on the region. But for the political management, for the organizers, the task was to show that support grew compared to 2012, and voters, according to voters, the main candidate received more votes than in 2012. And so that's why they did this. During the previous electoral cycles, the difference between turnout during parliamentary elections and presidential elections was about 7%. That was the difference, 7 to 10%. So if 49, 48% in 2016 was the turnout during parliamentary elections, then it realistically would be to assume that 58, 60% turnout will be during presidential elections. And also, not so much foreign political mobilization that affects the turnout. And there's no basis to assume that this turnout is a result of a foreign policy. We hear about this a lot. We hear about this from the chairman of the Central Electoral Committee. There is no basis for this. This is very theoretical and completely, we cannot support this or refute this. There is no data on this, and anybody can speak with their opinion, but it would be just their opinion. So it was very important for them, for the organizer of this elections, to secure the turnout, because they believe that historical events took place since 2016, and this turnout needed to demonstrate the approval of the population. That's why they wanted to do this. I guess my time is almost up, and the more detailed data will be provided maybe during later time. So thank you very much. Kirill, your turn. Hello, thank you. Yes, thank you to the Kennan Institute for inviting me again. I'm glad to be back in this wonderful institute. I'd like to say three things. And I'm going to maybe skip what Ekaterina said about how the elections were organized and say instead that the statistics from the elections, the percentages of votes is rather honest from theoretical point of view. It gives us a very clear understanding about what type of regime are we dealing with. And there are several types of regimes. If you have a competitive regime, then the final votes for the victor is going to be from 50 to 60%. If you have a soft authoritarian regime, what does it mean, soft authoritarian regime? It means that the main candidate will be somewhere between 60-65%. It is a slightly different regime where the opposition is rather legitimate. Why, in the democratic regime, it would be closer to the 50%? Because in that regime, structurally, resources are distributed more competitively between various elite groups, between various political groups, and they have access to these resources, and they consolidate and amass certain ideology and support, and this is a competitive system that will gravitate towards balance, 51%, 49%. Soft authoritarian regime will create about 60 to 65%. What is happening there? There's a legitimate opposition. There's opposition media. There is opposition leaders who are stable and support opposition, and the opposition has some weight, but it can never win. It can, gain 20, 30%. It exists. It presents a threat, but it will never win. And so this is the soft authoritarian regime. And then the next level is the regime where the main candidate never changes or party and receives more than 70%, maybe 75%, maybe 85%, maybe sometimes even 90%. But this is a completely different type of a regime. It doesn't have elites that compete with them, very few opposition media, and repressions and ideology has a greater role than in small authoritarian regimes that have a better dynamic, very little interest in ideology, less use of repressions, and a kind of in this regard, elections that we observed this time and the statistics that we observed this time, 77%, is a new level for Russia. And this is a new event in Russia's history. It's unprecedented. There was Russia of 1971, but 77, was really mature authoritarianism. During mature authoritarianism, can we only see such numbers? And this macro model of several types of regimes give you three we can see represented in the world, but we also see it in Russia. If you look at Russian regions, kind of looking back in retrospection, we will see that Russia had it all. There were regions where during federal and regional elections there was a small majority the winning, and then there were regions where 65-70%, where the candidates supported by the government were gaining votes. So there was a kind of nice distribution like that. And the gradation was described as three Russias. This is the data of the elections in 2016 into Duma. There are three Russias. Russia number 3 has 15% of voters living on its territory and about 75% turnout. And unified Russia received 75% of the vote. This is republics and various remote areas where political culture is very conservative. There are no observers. Nobody controls the elections. Whatever they put down, that's what is accepted. Russia 1 is 7% of population who vote and 38% turnout, and you can see the ruling party vote here. And we can see that Единая Россия and its victory, so Russia 3 had 8 million, Russian 1 11 million. You can see that they're approximately equal because this one has 3 times more voters, and Russia 2 is a kind of a mixture between them. And at these elections, this is what we saw. Blue, you can see all the Russian regions. Blue is the regions who gave their votes to Putin in 2012. You see Chechnya, Moscow, and you can see the numbers. Moscow dropped because Russia had very good observers and monitors, and it was lagging by 6 points from the next regions. So we can see how observers can make an impact, but you can see this trajectory here. Russia 1 over here, or Russia 3 over there. And what do we see? Russia 1 disappeared. All was leveled off, and Russia 1, large cities, it no longer exists at these elections. And this is where 11 million votes can be found, those additional 11 million votes. And this is the table showing what happened in 2012 and 2018. I'd like to show you that the difference that Putin had 70 in 2012, and now he has 83% and 76.5% respectively. So you can see this sort of conservative turnout, and we have instead of 3 Russias, we have 1.5 Russia. I don't want to talk too long about how this was done. There were a lot of tricks used, and Ekaterina mentioned some of them, and Dmitry will talk about them. There were some changes. By 2 million was reduced the written-in voters. Crimea gave 1.5 million of new voters. There were also mobile voters, and I think that people who changed, samples during a hole in the wall, they can come up with very new, very inventive tactics. But it's important for us to notice these changes and to understand what kind of issues are we dealing with. Putin is popular. He presents a more radical conservative agendas, and he is in his last speech and mobilizing voters even more who vote for them. You can look at it that way. I, however, believe that we are dealing with authoritarian institutions which have taken great foothold in Russia and have become stronger and create this new situation. And this idea of support, the whole term of support, is meaningless here and unnecessary. We see, based on many episodes, how one very popular authoritarian leader with 80% support disappears, and then the next one comes and also has 80%. We see this in Central Asia and other places. So it's not reflecting popularity of any particular individual, it is an institutional effect. And this is what we see here. It reflects deep structures of society, that the elites are built, there is no competition to them, no other elites competing with them, and that it becomes more and more expensive to be in the opposition. People gravitate towards conformism, and everything it transforms into propaganda. Ideology and repressions grow. So this is how the regime is changing. It's not about popularity, it's about these institutions. And authoritarian institutions became rather successful, and we see it. But it also has, what I'm telling you, it's important to just make distinctions between Putin's popularity, because if we believe the first theory, then we will not see some processes that are behind these, this strengthening of these institutions. A week and a half ago, Moskovskaya Validata published a paper about Sberbank, about commercial companies in Russia, and it was very interesting results. The main public discourse describing gender norms is rather conservative. The man is the breadwinner. Gender equality is impossible. The genders are very different. The man is the breadwinner, and the woman keeps the home and must raise the children. So this is not a very radical, but conservative, moderate, patriarchal discourse. And then we find out that the same people, in the practice, have completely different things. Women earn a lot of money, they build their career, they manipulate men, they make their own decisions, they have their own finances and manage them. And we see that in practice. These practices represent greater the modernization model that we expect to see. But public discourse is gravitating towards more conservative area. So you must not talk about it. You must position yourself more archaic and more patriarchal terms. So we must understand this kind of possible dynamics about what could be happening in Russia, because we must not become complacent, and we must see that the country has evolved into a different state of authoritarian institutions that were built over the past 6 years. Do I have another 3 minutes? Yes. And I would like to say in the remaining time what is in store for Russia. Russia is at the threshold of a new political cycle. which will be happening with some very unfavorable factors. Economic stagnation, one of them, because GDP growth of 1.5% is not really a growth. This growth does not really require investment in the main capital. Those were already made, and 25% increase in export. All of this is very weak growth, and nobody expects that the growth will speed up. It's almost stagnation. That's the first unfavorable factor, and international isolation of Russia is the second unfavorable factors. And also, we have the problem of 2024, when Putin, according to the current constitution, will be elected new president again. And so this is the three factors that will dictate how the situation will evolve. And everything will be made even more complicated by the following. If we look at the succession model, we can see that it didn't really survive on the post-Soviet in the post-Soviet time. A successor in the paternalistic model, the patronalistic model, happens when the boss takes power from the previous elites and creates new elites and gives the power to them. And so the successor stays loyal to his godfather, but must reform the elites, because only through that process can he achieve power. And even a controlled successor like Medvedev was a difficult model to run, because he provoked politicization of elites and politicization of society. And so Putin is probably considering the successor model as an unviable one. And so the party model, according to various reasons, is also unsuitable. And the last factor that complicates for Putin his problem is that at his age, his near retirement, is also the generation of his associates is also the same age, and Russian oligarchs are also aging. And so this transfer is relevant not just for Putin himself, but for his people of his generation and their successors, and the transfer of assets that are not secured by any other means than Putin's power. So this creates an additional negative and complicated transition situation for him. Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to especially thank Sergei Parkhomenko, who is to the left of me and who organized all of this. And I would also like to thank you for joining us. I would like to focus on a rather private matter. Evolution of territorial management, the control of the center over the region, and how it's reflected in statistics. Any electoral procedures are good because they leave traces in the form of numbers. And we see 85 subjects of Russian Federation, each of which is characterized by a number. This number is standard, the number who supported the main candidate, and according to the list of the candidates. So we see here the turnout and the consolidation of the votes in support of a candidate. So if we see 60%, it means that the turnout was 0.75, or Putin was supported by 0.85, and by multiplying them, we have our number. So we see 19 regions who saw this parameter more than 60%, and I agree with Kirill, we can call this as a sign of a mature authoritarianism. Among these regions are 5 Russian: Bryanskaya, Komirovskaya, Umyrskaya, Krasnodarsky Krai, and Sevastopol, and the rest are republics. And I'm using these terms to speak about what Russia called Russia 3. I call this electoral sultanates, not because of their ethnic ethnic composition. No, there's Kemerovskaya Oblast, and here we have Bryanskaya Oblast. But because these regions, not because these regions have some kind of federal status of republic or not a republic, no. They can be regions, oblasts, but even though republics dominate. But this is a sign of a special organization of regional authorities. In the Soviet Union, all regions were like that. 99.9 was the result. And so these I call the regional sultanates. Now, the geography of those results of the past elections. And we can see here that red and brown is Chukotka. And on the right, Tuva is dark green at the bottom, Kemerovo, and then Khanty-Mansiyski okrug, Tyumenskaya, Tatarstan, North Caucasus, Crimea, the zones where we can call electoral sultanates, and we can add the Bryanskaya Oblast there as well. And it's interesting to see that Putin's colors also belong to the red belt, which voted the same way in 1996. And it is obvious that the decisive factor of this integral that shows that in these official numbers, it reflects the votes of the population and the votes of the regional elites, and then the regional sultanates. The regional elites are the main final data. All right, let's look for comparison. I couldn't translate this into English. This is 2016 parliamentary elections into Duma, the same methods, same electoral sultanates to the right. I don't even have to list them. From Chechen Republic all the way to Chukotsky Autonomous Region, you can see paradoxical gradient from 91.4 percentage, which is very high, to 12% in St. Petersburg and Moscow. You can see that the gradient is in 5 times difference. Let's look next, the same map from 2016. And if you look at it and you remember the previous map, you'll see that the picture is the same. Chukotka at the top, Tuva and Kemerovskaya Oblast at the bottom, Khanty-Mansiyski, Tyumensky, and the red belt, which became blue because the local elites are supporting Putin in '96. They were fighting for conservative Soviet values and their status, but now they support Vladimir Putin. And this is the most interesting slide. I don't know, maybe not for you, but it is for me. And the same metrics used to calculate 1991 in the Soviet Union vote to preserve Soviet Union. And this data exists only on national territories. And you can see similar picture, that you can see that in 1990s, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Transnistria and so forth on the right. And then on the left, we see the regions which showed up, which were the minimum, the west of the former Soviet Union. And here the gradient exceeds 10. If on the right we see 100%, on the left we see 5–10%. So the data we used there were the data of electoral consultations that happened in the Baltics and in Georgia, Moldova. So what does this mean? If we compare parliamentary elections of 2016, we see some similarities. The gradient there was 6, maybe 5, but now in 91 we see that the gradient is 10. But this is considering democratization of the Soviet Union, when Gorbachev for the first time tried to count votes honestly. If he wasn't trying it, then we would see a very even line, and it would be 99% as it was in Turkmenia. Picture doesn't show very well, but this is Soviet map, Soviet Union, and you can see the geographic asymmetry on the left, less than 20%, all the western part from Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, including Moldova, and then Armenia and Georgia showed minimum. And of course, maximum is Turkmen, Uzbek, Russia in this picture is in the middle. What does it mean? It means that it is somewhere in the middle, but inside Russia there was also asymmetry. Ethnic or national territories in Russia gave 65%, whereas the Russian territories gave 52.2%, again based on the list. So then inside Russia, when vote was to preserve Soviet Union, the gradient was 0.2%, so very small difference, but now it has grown significantly. So how did this all happen? How did the elections evolve? In '96, Yeltsin and Zyuganov was the first tour, most competitive, and we see that there wasn't such a split between left and right sides. We see different colors. Somewhere Yeltsin won, somewhere Zyuganov won, and also we see a split in electoral sultanates. Chechnya voted for Yeltsin, Ingushetia voted for Yeltsin, and right next to them, Northern Ossetia and Orlovskaya Oblast or Dagestan, which actively voted for Zyuganov. But no 95% turnout. Average turnout 65-70%, give or take. No 90% vote for anybody personally. Maximum votes that Zyuganov had was in Dagestan in the first tour was 65%. And so we see up to 40%. What is important to note here? There were no candidates who were not allowed to participate. There were no victor. There was no sense of total control from the center over the regions. Regional leaders were doing what they wanted, and for the most part, they were supporting Zyuganov. The sultanates didn't want Moscow craziness. They wanted to go back to the Soviet Union and supported Zyuganov. And conclusions are rather clear. Turnout was up to 70%, consolidation less than 2 times, and then the 2-round vote was in line with a normal European tradition. Then we had competition, and then it was more real elections, and Yeltsin won in just elections because he received a maximum votes not where it was easiest for him to falsificate in sultanates who supported Zyuganov, but where it was difficult to falsificate in large cities that supported him. And the gradient in '96 was only 2. And we must understand that Putin, as an elite phenomenon, was a reaction of Russian elites to real threat to lose their control over the territory. And Yeltsin in the Kremlin also understood this, and that's why he was looking for such a person as Putin, because he was afraid that under democracy, Russia would just split at the seams. This is, after Yeltsin, the history of voting using the same metrics, beginning in 2000. In 2000, the winner was only one. Everywhere, the sultanates have reoriented themselves, but not entirely. We see that the Kemerov Oblast is on the left, the most opposition corner, instead of others, because Tuleyev was running, and all of his authoritarian resource he used for himself. If he tried to do that today, he wouldn't have succeeded. On the right, we see Dagestan, Ingushetia, Kabardin, Tatarstan, and all of that standard selection, and then we see the gradients. Here we see 80%, and then over there we see 20%. So we see 4 times the gradient. And we must also remember that the independence of the regions is also not as much, and the center dominates. This is the next electoral cycle, 2012, and the resistance of regional elites has been broken. Putin's consensus of the elites exists, and sultanates then compete for who can show greatest support to the Kremlin. And more than 50% is in 25%. 65% is communists. Kemerovskaya Oblast supported Putin. Oryol Oblast, under the management of Yegor Stroyev, always voted for communist. Northern Ossetia, we can see that the gradient is going down. And then Medvedev elections, you can see leveling off, the gradient is lowering. Sultanates, of course, actively participating, and you can see that those elections showed statistically maximum falsifications. And we can clearly see here the difference between the so-called Asia and so-called European part of Russia. See Ivanovskaya, Vladimirskaya, Kaliningradskaya, Rязанskaya, Samarskaya, and Karelia oblasti, and then we see those eastern regions on the right. 2012. And it's interesting that the gradient is low, and the picture is very stable. It just we can just see that Putin has consolidated administrative resource using the so-called corruption buyout of support from the local elites, who receive great support from the government and are under government control, therefore. And Moscow is in opposition. We can see Moscow to the left as a large city that needs some kind of democratic transformations. Right next to it is Vladimirskaya Oblast. Karelia is a republic, but very Russian and westernized. Irkutskaya Oblast, Leningradskaya, Komsomolskaya, Tomskaya. On the left, no sultanates. All sultanates are on the right and are working to support the Kremlin exclusively. And we are at the end. This is the comparison of the diagrams since 96 up to 2018. In 96, we saw that trajectory is 20% lower. In 2012, it's going up, and we see big support in sultanates. In 18, the control is such that the sultanates were told, please don't give us 90%. Make it 85. We don't want a scandal. And that's what they did. And as far as central regions, which were more or less independent, they were told to improve their statistics, and therefore we see that the gradient had leveled off. And in 96, the trajectory was rather organic. In 2018 is artificial, it's regulated. And compared to 91, if we take Russia of 91, inside Russia the gradient was 0.2. But now in the best case scenario, even after such administrative methods, it became 2. And if we remember, when the administrative apparatus wasn't quite so loaded in 2016, the gradient was 6, and in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and St. Petersburg supported only 12% of the list. So falsifications have always existed and remain, but they changed. And manipulation, not so much of the ballots and votes is happening, but manipulation of actual people, actual people are brought and removed, and it is also falsifications of, this is called manipulative technology, and it reminds us of the Soviet times. And so I'm going to talk now about the elections. We see USSR in miniature, or a hybrid of USSR, when the results of the elections depend on administrative resource, when we see consolidation of elites, and the population also is consolidated, not due to corrupt buyout, but through propaganda, but it depends on how the boss commands. And now we have such a Soviet picture, and we must understand that this Sovietization trend will continue in the future, and we will see centralization, militarization of public opinion, economic stagnation, isolationism. And let me remind you that in the Soviet Union, the turnout was always 99 in support for communism, and now 69, 70%. It's a bit of difference, but not a significant difference. And I'm saying this so that we view what's happening in Russia with suspicion, and under the surface of all of these tricks, we see the processes that happened in '91. Electoral sultanates control the process in Moscow and other advanced territories. There's sort of control, but we don't know what's going on under the surface. And in order to support the system, they will be using Soviet methods. They will confront the West. They will build up new iron fence. And when I look at your charts and your comparisons, I see the word, this observer effect. The observer noticed what happened in 2012 and decided to change their activities to be a little bit less obvious. Sergei, I will try and talk about the future, and I think there will be more questions about that. Of course, the results of these elections become interesting when we analyze various correlations, not just the numbers themselves, but various balances between them. What is a result of Yavlinsky in regards to result of Sobchak? What is Grudinin in relation to Zhirinovsky? And what is Zhirinovsky in relation to Zyuganov? What is Putin now in relation to Putin then? And what is Sobchak now in relation to Prokhorov then? And based on these comparisons, we can see some interesting trends. But the most interesting thing, and that's why all of our speakers have spoken in great detail about this, is what is happening with various regions in Russia and various territories of Russia. If we look at these events of the past several elections beginning in 2004, we understand that the main resource, the main wealth, and the natural resource of Russia is not oil and gas like we used to think, but votes. And nothing gives the administration and the governor and the local officials as much income, as much wonderful source of everything as, collecting this wonderful harvest. Those of you who remember the Soviet times and the program Vremya at 9 p.m., which began with, adding up the various harvest that is being stored. And so now they're harvesting these votes, and at each elections, they're supplying these harvested votes, and at each election we see new and new evolution of that. And we see that in the beginning, when Putin was, when the question whether the voters will support Yeltsin's choice. But beginning in 2004, we see this harvest of the votes really taking off. When Ramzan Kadyrov said, to the question of where your money comes from, he said, Allah gives it to me. So yes, the votes can be harvested and exchanged for government donations and financing. And so it's important to see that people who organize the harvesting, they understand that this is their main task. They are not interested in what is happening on their territory. They're not interested in what the people think, what their mood is, and what is the dynamics there. They're just growing and harvesting the votes. But afterwards, after the deed is done, they start to believe there's results. They start to act in accordance with what they themselves came up with. And they are thrilled because at the end they see great results. And some time ago, in 2001, long time ago, when we had this big process of destruction of a media corporation of Gusinsky and the TV station Dozhd, NTV, not Dozhd, NTV. Yes, I misspoke. That was interesting. Yes, they crushed Dozhd a little later. Then Sergei Dorenko, who at that time was still a journalist, a very different journalist from what he is today, I remember in one of the NTV's programs, he had this metaphor that we are sitting here and talking, and there's some events are happening, but somewhere far away at some dump of old rusted mechanisms, there's a quiet music playing, and strange robots are rising to this music all over the country and are starting to move, and they hear this tune, and among them arises some kind of understanding. These robots begin to move, and they hear this sound that sounded on the 18th of March in Moscow. Let's look at today's news. Just the news of today, 20th of March. And you will see the decision of the Supreme Court that one of the most popular messengers of Russia, Telegram, must open their codes for Secret Service and demonstrate their emails with the government. You will see the Prosecutor General's request for 10 years imprisonment for Dmitriev, the activist Dmitriev, where experts have proven that the charges against him are false. Nonetheless, he must spend 9 years in prison, according to the prosecution. And yesterday, you probably read Margarita Simonyan's tweet. A wonderful tweet by Margarita Simonyan, which is famous now, where she speaks to you, people who live outside of Russia and who have more or less liberal convictions. She says, before he was just our president and we could change him, but now he is our leader, our chief, and we will not allow you to change him, replace him, and you did this with your own two hands. So this is the head of the main propaganda channel of Russia. So we were mistaken about these elections. We were interfering in these elections? No, we were interfering in them all this time. We created liberalism so hated for the Russian voter. What is this? This is thrilling. Exaltation. Very important for Russia after these elections. They are thrilled with what they have done. They are thrilled with the harvest. And they think that they learned something important about their country, the country that they manipulate. They start to believe their own deeds. And it's important. We must understand that the tightening of the noose that we expect coming from the Russian government will manifest in this strange psychological phenomenon when they look at themselves in the mirror and like themselves more and more. Thank you, Sergey. Thank you, everyone. You know, Ekaterina began with the suggestion that the technology is changing constantly, but after your reports on mobilization, on propaganda, at the place of employment, and Kirill then spoke about the institutions, and then Dmitry said about electoral sultanates, and then Sergei said about the hybrid of the USSR. I doubt there's anything new under the sun. This system is familiar to all of us, more or less. The new system is based new technologies, voting technologies, and the procedures for voting are based on a very well learned lessons of the Soviet past. But my question has to do with something else. Not so much structure or processes or technologies. You perfectly described what happened inside, and outside of the system. But what happened inside the person himself? Who played a role in this process? The person who physically showed up at the poll, gave his vote for this Putin. What was he expecting? Why did he do it? I understand that, yes, maybe at work, his boss, in short term, he's expecting some kind of a buffet, or maybe some vodka, or maybe a day off during the week, or maybe congratulations from his boss. But what was he thinking when he showed up and voted for Putin? Did he even get a little throwback to the Soviet times? Did he think about this golden Soviet past? How do you think these people, what did they feel when they showed up for these elections? All right, let me try to answer it. This is the question about the motivations of the voters. And we can only guess here about these motivations, because if we had the possibility, if we had independent sociology, if we can poll the voters about their motivations and believe their answers, it would be wonderful. But right now, we can only speak in general terms. And I have said people came to elections based on the place of their employment. They were mobilized by their employer to vote. But we shouldn't think that they were threatened in any way to come and vote. Maybe it happened somewhere in some kind of hidden way when students were told that if you want to continue to live in the dormitory, you must participate in the votes. But it is not a widespread practice. People go to vote because it is expected, because it is some kind of a correct, socially approved action. And paradoxically, a factor here is the progress of morality, so to speak. And the propaganda of elections is an important event. People understand that elections are good, and participation in them and their sort of citizens' position is good. But let's imagine that you showed up at the voting poll, not because you were forced to, but you came early in the morning so that you could have the rest of the weekend to yourself. You came with your family, with your children. Many former observers have seen this sort of family holiday where people came with children, took pictures. The child put the little cross in during the voting. So you received this ballot. And if you are a conformist voter, your first conformist step must be followed by a second conformist step. If you don't have what the Soviets used to call, nothing, you must vote correctly. And imagine the list of the candidates. Which of these candidates does not make you laugh? Which of the candidates can you vote for without feeling self-conscious and uncomfortable explaining your choice. Which of the candidates looks like the most serious candidate? And so in Russia, people vote for the boss because it is the boss. People who is the boss has the right to some support. And all the rest of candidates were protest votes, very clear protest. I don't want to offend anybody, but it's hard to imagine that anybody voted for these candidates because they liked them. So if you are a serious family man with a good job who came to the polls, to the polling stations, you will vote for the only option that is viable to you. Whether you're thinking about whether it's good to have such wonderful foreign policy, or whether you think it's good that you have received an increase to your pension, or whether it's good to work in Gazprom and you want to continue, we don't know. And it's impossible to see any direct correlation between the foreign policy and these results of elections. There's no foundation for it whatsoever. When we look at the polls on what problems the citizens are most concerned with, say the main 3 or 4 or 5 main problems that are concerned, foreign policy is at the very end of their list. It's like number 10. The first 3 problems is prices, wages, and healthcare or utilities. And so we see that foreign policy does not even make the cut of the most serious issues of concern. And this is a very abstract concept anyway for a majority of Russian people. It's some pictures on the TV. It is not correlated with their actual lives in any way. 28% of people have a foreign passport for foreign travel. And so not very many people travel, and those who do go to Turkey, to Egypt for vacations. So it's not really a democracy is there either. So foreign policy is fairy tale to them. And so I think most we can say about their motivation is this. Thank you, Ekaterina. And don't look at the clock. The clock is incorrect. We still have 15 minutes at least. So let's give our audience a chance to ask some questions. We have these microphones here on both sides. Please introduce yourself, your name, and if you have an affiliation, who you represent, and then your questions with the question mark at the end. Thank you. So much interesting stuff. Voice of America, Russian service. Sergey has said a very interesting thing about the constant looking up when these people, harvest the votes, that they are not concerned at all with whether they reflect the reality. They just want to harvest these votes and then use them for their own benefit. And so my question is to the other experts. Is there an effect of this constant, over the past 18 years, there's this looking up and the loss of feedback? Every administrative level is interested only in survival after sort of the opinion of the higher-ups of them. And so they're not interested in the feedback from the levels below. And what effect do you think it's going to have in the next 6 years? It is a long time. This is a long term. And so there should be some kind of already result that we can see of this constant practice. I would just like to ask one more question to Sergey, as he is a specialist. Yes, please be brief. What effect for the media do you see in this next 6 years, because it is one of the most important components? Thank you. One more question. My name is Marina Galtsova. I am a lawyer from Memorial and a researcher here at the Kennan Institute. And my question is the following. I was not surprised by the results of the elections, but I also understand that abroad, Putin also got 85% abroad. And of course, there are military bases, but that can't explain it all. How can you explain such numbers in support of Putin abroad? Thank you. Thank you. So, if the effect of the power vertical on the feedback with the population and the support abroad. The voting abroad is actually a clear picture, because you see them as New York and London, but it is Abkhazia, Southern Ossetia, Transnistria, Donetsk and Luhansk, and nobody knows how many of these territories, but they'll give you whatever numbers you want. If you look at the results of the voting in London, Yabloko received 28%, but if you look at it all together, all the foreign territories, you will see 80% for Putin, because of the sector that they do control. That is sort of like abroad, but it's not really. Yes, Transnistria have about 400,000 people, and half of them have Russian citizenship. And abroad, there's also no observers. Andrei Sarafanov is sitting there, who was an observer here in D.C. The day before yesterday. And I was with him together last time, and I observed it all with my own two eyes. It is a rather foggy picture about this voting. Andrei, how many voted? How many voted here? 3,400. 2,400? But not here. There were only 5 other polling stations. So you counted 2,400. That's in the United States overall? No, this is just Washington, D.C. and a few Miami and others, maybe. So 2,400. And there were thousands and thousands of people registered at the consulates. 85%. What are these 85%? Nobody really understands, that these numbers are very inflated. And this picture of many people, crowds of people at these foreign polling stations, Margarita Simonyan posted these pictures, London, Berlin, Paris. Okay, let's look at Germany overall, the 4 polling stations there, and see. Let's look at all of the United States. Let's just have, if you reduce the number of polling stations, of course you'll have crowds of people at them. So this is just another piece of propaganda. And embassy people, maybe they're here. Anybody here? I bet there's some of them here. Maybe they can tell us that they're also dependent. They also have to harvest, and they have to report to their bosses. And so there's some kind of quiet competition between embassies of Berlin and Rome, despite the import substitution. I think we have digressed. Question on the vertical of power and the feedback. All right, I'll try. It is a very interesting and exciting process because the patronage networks, this vertical personal connections, Putin has his oligarchs have their own smaller oligarchs, they have heads of enterprises, and you have this pyramid. And this hasn't been studied well, but it is a living construct that has a feedback, and a very important feedback. This is very important. And we have actually seen this at the end of the Soviet Union when from below there's no support, and the elites, they can't really control the lower levels. They cannot, command. They see there's no support, and so they start to express their displeasure to the higher ups. And so this feedback is actually an important one, and it destroys such network, at least temporarily, and then they can self-repair. It doesn't mean there's going to be democracy afterwards, but they do break and then self-repair. And if we look at the political cycles over the past 20 years, we'll see that population and elites' expectations are very important, and not just what they think of today's economy, but their expectations about this economy. And we have seen of the past 18 years some changes. When in 2004 and prices for oil went up, everything was good, and then in 2009 when prices on oil crashed and everything was bad, and people were starting to doubt Putin's vertical. And then in 2013, 2012, when the expectations were good, everything was great, and Putin started to apply his, pressure and dominate. And people realize that the prices on oil can go up and go down, but everything will be okay for us. And people realize that they are not afraid of the fluctuations of oil prices, and they can live. The price fell from very high to average. Now we have the average price per barrel, if we look from the 70s. And so everything's going okay. And this adaptation is happening. If we compare with the 1970, when everybody was afraid that if the prices of oil collapse, we'll all collapse with it. It's not going to happen. The prices of oil allow us to survive, no matter what they are. But there is some depression due to the lack of economic growth, and the money is distributed differently in the economy during this stagnation rather than during growth. There's a different logic for distribution of resources, and some tensions are created because of that. But the changes are happening, and the depression, as it continues, can lead to, and probably will lead to, further depression. And there is a feedback, and it will manifest when the expectations change. Right now, people's expectations that sanctions will not gonna cause any problems, but when the expectations change, then we'll see a different feedback. All right, let's spend the next 10 minutes and let's have a second round of questions and listen to 2 or 3 more questions. Who else would like? No? Nobody? Vladimir Umenyuk. I am a military attaché in Ukraine. My first commentary to Oreshkin, when he was speaking with his analysis, he said that Sevastopol supported. I said that Sevastopol, just like Crimea, is temporarily occupied territory, and the sooner it returns under the jurisdiction of Ukraine, the better. It is a question of time. And so my question is to Kirill Rogov. You have made a good correlation between the percentage of support to the regional leaders and the classification of regimes. And I'm interested to see how the survivability of these regimes. Do you think the Putin's regime has good survival prospects? Two or three times, Yeva Birar, Kenan Institute, you said that Russia isolated, maybe relatively it is isolated. It has lived through 2 wars. It is participating in European energy policy with this northern route. It has a well-developed soft power and utilize and in the way it's using it in regards to social opinion in the West. And it's not entirely isolated from the outside world. And somehow this does not influence your picture of the future. My question is to Kirill Rogov. It's not static. This, the picture of the future is not static. And maybe we should take into account this aspect. I agree with Ekaterina Shulman, who said that for many people, foreign policy is some fairy tale, but I don't agree altogether with her statement that it can use social mobilization. I think social aspect should not be ignored. Hello, my name is Yelena. I have a question about the young people who are Putin's fans, who strongly support him. Center Levato had a poll. They polled 6,000 students aged 18 through 24, and 85% said that they support Putin's policy, and 47%, I think, said that they will vote for him. Why there is such a trend? Why in social networks famous people, celebrities support Putin, and how will it influence the next elections 6 years from now? Because he will, by then, will be in power for 24 years, and many people by then will be younger than he has been in power. Yes, so youth for Putin, isolation, and survivability of the regime. Who would like to tackle those? All right, I'll try to tackle the survivability. I like that question. Well, first of all, I would like to object against the whole term, Putin's regime. Yes, of course, it is common for people to look at other people and are interested in labeling people, it's easy for us to understand reality if we label things, especially if we look at all the data. We will see that this is a political system that existed before today's president. It existed before he even appeared on the scene, and it will probably supersede him as well. It is a rather stable system. Even if we believe that this authoritarian trend and evolution is happening, nonetheless, we cannot ignore the fact that this transitional phase remains. Why there are fewer pure dictatorships now exist? Why democratic processes are happening even there? Why everybody has alternative parties? Why there are different media? Because it makes regimes more stable. Political regime in Russia has advantages of the partially competitive economy and media environment. environment. It actually gives it an advantage over the Soviet system, which was rigid and unadaptable. The current system is much more adaptable to the changing environment and also demand from society. And second, another big subject, I believe that the system depends less on a single person than we are led to believe. Personalization of the regime is greatly exaggerated, and therefore I have seen those 4 Medvedev's years when the same resources were transferable to another person, and they say that the previous president became the prime minister, but at the same time the overall power of the president is greater than the prime minister's power. But this switch out happened, and no great cataclysms in the political machine followed, although there were some interesting processes noted, but the system preserved and persevered in the way that we know it. And so I think that drawing these parallels and making these kinds of forecasts on the authoritarian path is not going to be supported by real life. Processes rarely go in a straight line. You cannot really forecast a straight path of development. It never happens. In social and political space, all trends go in a zigzag. And as far as the authoritarian trend, I always ask myself, why hasn't it happened yet? Why Belarusian model hasn't took root in Russia? We don't have the Belarusian model. The Russian model is somewhere between the Central Asian sultanates that have been mentioned here and the Western European models, which are much more democratic. It's somewhere in between them, but it does not really fall into one or the other extreme. And when we say that it's going to happen, it doesn't really answer. It doesn't really answer why it hasn't happened yet. There hasn't been any other obstacles that would have prevented it from going that way. What about the youth supporting Putin? Who's going to answer that? Okay, I'll try to tackle the youth issue. The simple answer, the simple part of your question, is the celebrities that support Putin. Yes, it's very simple to explain. It is part of their profession. It's their job. And they cannot really be celebrities without fulfilling that part of the social contract. You know, they get screen time based on that. That's what they fight for that. In Russian show business, you know, you only exist if you are on the TV. You don't exist if you are not on TV. And including Viktor Shenderovich, you know, who couldn't even go outside in 2004 because he was immediately surrounded by fans, or Lazareva shots. Remember those people, how popular they were when they were on TV, and when they disappeared from TV, they disappeared from the face of the earth. After 2011, when they were all of a sudden banned from TV, and Ksenia Sobchak also felt it in 2011. It's very simple. If you want to work, go to Luzhniki and sing. And they did. They sang whatever it is they were ordered to sing, and they will continue to do it for as long as necessary. As far as the youth, there are many various factors. At some levels, there is also the cult of power. Whoever's in power, whoever's on top, is the coolest one, and that's who I will support. And it is some kind of a calculation, intended or not, because that really, because with Moscow, and people connect all of their opportunities for growth, for opportunities for promotion. People understand, how many, you don't forget how many horrible places are there in Russia where if you visit them, you wonder how did people even survive there. But that is the majority of the country. In those places that is even unclear why people should live in Norilsk. That's not as a person who lives from 200 kilometers from Moscow. I was going to take offense. For example, city Kashin, who is less than 200 kilometers from Moscow, and I wonder why do people live there and why they remain there. In Nizhny Udinsk, who is 100 kilometers from Irkutsk. Irkutsk is a large city, a big industrial center, and it's hard to understand. People must hope that they can crawl out of those places, and their hope is tied to Putin because they are the harvest, and they must, together with their bosses, provide the harvest, and that makes things simple. As far as the question of the future, you remember Murat Niyazov? I don't want to tell horrible stories about Ceausescu. There was Super Murat Niyazov. He was given like a golden statue in the middle of the capital of, he was revolving around, following the sun. And then it turned out that he has a dentist. And then I think we're moving towards some Asian fairy tales. And so you had a dentist. He also had a golden statue. They say that he is much more modest, but they love him just as much. I think now would be the correct time to stop our discussion because we have already went over our allotted time. And let's thank our experts and our audience. Thank you very much.